Good morning, and welcome to Mentsch at Work. This is our weekly series where we explore the laws of being a Mentsch in the workplace, the Jewish legal code, I guess, if you will. No, not really. This is not the legal code. There's a whole legal code about, the laws of the Bet Din, and when somebody comes to a court of law, and how to resolve disputes between litigants, etc. There's all those laws as well. This is just the laws of us working in the workplace, how we can be a Mentsch in the workplace, whether that's enforceable or not, as we discussed, right? Whether that's punishable or not doesn't make a difference. There's the right and the wrong thing to do. So last week, we discussed the obligations that an employee has to their employer, right? So things like making sure that you're coming at not necessarily peak energy, but a reasonable level of energy. You can't pull an all-nighter and then come to work and reasonably take money for work that you're going to do over a day when your focus is very different because you haven't slept all night, right? You cannot take a second job that's going to take your energy and your focus and your talents away for many other hours. You could take a side small job, something that's within reasonable within reasonable expectation. But if you sign a contract with somebody that you're going to work for them from 9 to 5, you can't take a contract with somebody else that you're going to work with them from 5 to 9, right? Or something like that, which is basically going to mean that when you come, you're kind of not working the entire time. And we discussed that obviously all that is within reason, within what a normal person would expect. And I get it, that's very difficult to label and very difficult to put your finger on. Like obviously you're allowed to look at your coworker and say, good morning, how was your weekend, etc. Even though that's not technically working, you don't have to be OCD about it. But that is those are the general obligations of an employee to an employer. And then we discussed poaching and the opposite of poaching. Working for someone and meanwhile going to find out from somebody else about whether they'll pay you a higher salary. All those, what are the ethics and what are the morals of all those things? Depends whether they're paying you a higher salary, depends whether the skill set that you have is unique, etc. And we discussed all those details last week. Yes, everybody remember? Okay. Yeah. Today we're going to flip the script. Today we're going to ask the question on the opposite, when the shoe is on the other foot. What are the obligations that an employer has to an employee? Yes? And when we're going to talk about this, the first and most important mitzvah to keep in mind is a mitzvah called halanas schar. Halanas schar means leaving the wages overnight. Overnighting the wages. In other words, in English, overnighting has come to mean sending it overnight. Yeah. So what would be the term for floating the wages, floating the salary, later delaying payment later down the line. And the term that's used is halanas. Halanas means doing it overnight. Okay, we'll soon see that's because the basic case that's going to be used is when somebody does work for you, like a plumber or an electrician, just that one job for you. Okay. Before we start these laws, I want to remind everybody that just like in the public discourse, and I know a lot of people personally that are landlords, they don't like that all landlords get lumped into this one bad guy group. Everybody familiar with what I'm talking about? Like in the public discourse, landlord's always the bad guys. Whenever somebody pictures a landlord, they imagine somebody that's like got 10 buildings, and each building he wants his rent on time, etc. And they don't talk about the fact that there are lots of regular people who are like they're actually the small guy who has a house and he's barely managing to pay for the house and he's trying to get his rent from it in order to cover it because it's an investment that he has for his children for the future, whatever. Right? They don't talk about those landlords. So I want to remind everybody the same thing when it comes to employers. When we say employers here, we're not only talking about the owner of JP Morgan Chase or of Kaiser or whatever it is that has thousands and thousands of employees and is paying bankroll, etc. We are also we're not even just talking about somebody who has a small business and has one employee that he has to pay. We're also talking about you. Even if you're not a business owner, if you have, for example, a plumbing job in your house needs to be done, and you hire a plumber, you are an employer, and the plumber is the employee. Everybody with me here? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know that's probably not the proper term in English. I don't think it would be called an employer and employee. It's probably like a contract, independent contractor that you hire, whatever it is. But from and we're going to see that there's a difference between those two categories from a Jewish perspective. But regardless, in all situations, there's the employer and the employee is the person who's hiring someone else to work for them, regardless of whether that's a long-term contract that you make and they're your consistent employee, or whether they are somebody that you hire just on a one-time basis just to do a job for you. Regardless, you are paying them, therefore that makes you the employer and them the employee. Everybody with me? Yeah. Okay. So hopefully what that did for you is, when you came into this conversation, we're talking theoretically about employers, you're like, hold on, this is talking about me. Okay, these are laws that are talking about us. So with that in mind, let's get started. Yes? We'll start because it's a brand new mitzvah, right? We said that there's going to be a lot of mitzvahs when it comes to this. It's like 40, 50 mitzvahs at least that go into the laws of business being a mention in the workplace. So this is a brand new mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah we spoke about before. And the Shulchan Aruch starts off, mitzvah lase schar pe'ula sachir bizmanai. It is a mitzvah to pay a worker his wages on time. And if a person delays them, he violates one of the Torah's prohibitions, as is stated, Shenemar, Beyomo titin scharo v'lo tavo alav hashemesh. This is a verse from Devarim, from Deuteronomy, chapter 24, verse 15, if you want to look it up. And it says, pay him his wages on the day they are due. Do not let the sun set without his having been paid. That is the Torah obligation. Now, right away, I imagine, I'm just going to say this because I know my crowd here. The crowd on Facebook, I have no idea who they are. There's like 4 people watching now, and I have no idea who they are. But and that's not people watch recordings later. I have no idea who they are. But the people here I know, and I know the people are going to have questions. What if he's a salaried worker and he gets paid at the end of the month, right? So then, does that mean that he has to pay him every day? No, he can pay him at the end of the month. How does that work? What about if he's delaying him for a reason? He tells him, hey, in advance, he tells him, this month I'm not going to be able to pay you on time. I'm going to be able to pay you 1 week late, and there's a legitimate reason for it, because they're waiting for a certain client that's going to be paying the thing. What if he just catches him at a time that the employee, I don't know, like maybe they didn't make up the exact date that he's going to pay him, and the employee asks for the salary, and he catches him on the street, and the guy doesn't have any cash in it. All of a sudden, because he didn't pay him, he becomes some sort of wicked person, like right? In other words, what if there's a reasonable reason why? So we're going to get into all those weeds as we go along. But first, Joe has a question. Go ahead.
Okay, sun sets. What if somebody's delayed like an hour or 2 or 3? Is that why I'm just splitting hairs?
That's a very good question.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it is. And it's part of what we're going to discuss. But at least for now, let's just talk, because right now all we have is the literal verse in the Torah, right? We haven't even gotten to details. But according to the literal verse in the Torah, that would be violating the prohibition. So in other words, he finishes the work for you at 2 p.m., and then overnight, to keep it overnight, that would be violating the prohibition. Not an hour or 2. It's not sunset kind of thing. It's an hour or 2 after a whole night went by.
Oh.
Yes.
Marilyn gave me a book that I was reading.
But there's much more to it, and we're going to get into it. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Marilyn gave me a book that I was reading on Shabbat.
No.
And it said, it was really interesting because it said a lot of the U.S. laws are based really in Torah law. And there's the U.S. law that says you have to pay the employee on the date that it's due. So whether it's weekly, monthly, whatever, you can't delay, and that the employee can actually get
What's the name of the book?
Surcharge. This is U.S. law.
What's the name of the book that you said, Marilyn?
Oh, it's Botek. It's
By Rabbi Bota?
yeah. What is it? Botek.
Boteach.
Botek.
Shmuley Boteach? Right. What's it called? Probably kosher or something. Isn't that all his books? All his books are called kosher?
Yeah.
I can't think of what the name is.
Okay.
But it was his
one
book
of his
about
books.
explained that, and it had a whole section about that so many of the laws are based in Torah law.
Okay.
And so I was thinking of this law that says you have to pay
Your workers on time, right,
the
yeah.
date that it's due.
Yep.
And they really uphold it. This is
In the U.S., you're
very
saying? Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure.
In the U.S., if you don't pay when due, even if you have a problem, the employee can demand that they get a surcharge every day for not paying. That's what I'm saying. It's the law, but this law came from the Torah.
Came from the Torah. So
That's what I'm-
it's a very interesting point you bring up. We once did a class here called Judaism's Gifts to the World. That one's an old one. It's at least 7 years old. 6 or 7 years old. Was anybody here by that one? I don't know. So I remember it was a small crowd, and I felt that they did a bad job of the marketing, but the class was fantastic. The basis of the class was that there are many laws in the U.S. and in general in the West that find their origins in Judaism. And they just chose 6 gifts. Judaism's gifts, things that come directly from the Torah, and they traced the line, which was really cool. It wasn't just the Torah says so, and then 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later, American law says so. It was they showed how it slowly went into British law and how they were inspired by the Torah, it was taken from the Torah, and then eventually moved in. And there were 6 things that they highlighted. One of them was Shabbat. One of them was Tzelem Elokim, being created in the image of God. Another one, and there were laws from the right to own property. obviously the value of human life. In other words, what they did was, with each one, they showed how there was a time when most of the world outside of the Jews did not value this thing, and actually sometimes even anti-Semites at the time made fun of Jews for this thing. Like, for example, Shabbat. Today the weekend is such a normal thing. Like, America actually is the least of all, right? Like in some countries they have longer weekends or less work, etc. Right? And but the idea of working just 7 days straight, just spinning your wheels, is completely frowned upon in most of the Western world. And there was a time when Jews were made fun of and were actually persecuted because they were lazy and because they had to take a day off, starting from Paro, by the way, in the 6th parsha. Yesterday's parsha. Right? He says, Nirpim atam nirpim. He says, you guys are just lazy. Right? You know, at the last aliyah of yesterday's.
They were fired.
You're talking about in America years later.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they were fired for not wanting to work on Shabbos. Yes,
Yeah.
correct. So that was a course that we did back in the day. Why am I mentioning it? I'm mentioning it because there's another course coming up. You know me, I always have one. There's a course coming up starting in the summer. It's actually going to be a commemorative course. It's a course that's meant to celebrate 250 years to our amazing country. This year will be the 250th anniversary since 1776. And we are going to be doing a Torah course to celebrate it. I hope you will all be there. It's going to be a fantastic course. Just on Thursday, I had a meeting with, as you know, they're always asking me to preview things and see things. So we had a whole conversation about it and the marketing for it, behind it, etc. We're going to be doing a course for 250 years for the U.S. It's called Sinai and Civics. And we're going to be talking about a lot of the American values, very similar to this, but with a laser focus on America. American values that you can clearly see come from where the founding fathers got them from. A lot of this is documented, by the way, in documents, that they built these ideas on previous ideas, and those ideas on previous ideas, and a lot of them are directly sourced in the Torah. So we're going to be talking about that, specifically with a focus on the U.S. Constitution and the U.S., all right? But we got very off topic here. So that will be a summer course. We're doing a spring course. So obviously we're doing our winter course. Everybody knows about that one. It's called Captivating Cases in Rabbinic Responsa. That's the time traveling course, for those that saw the video. And that starts this coming Monday, not tomorrow, but a week from tomorrow. And then the next course is the spring course, which is after Pesach for 4 weeks. And then this other one is a 4-week course, which is starting right around July 4th. All right? Okay, so having said that, back to what we were talking about. So yes, Vicky, it's not surprising to me that there are laws in U.S. law that are based on Torah law, specifically with regards to delaying wages. But let's get some details on this, shall we? Because Joe has questions, and I'm sure everybody has questions. Let's get some details on this. Continues the Shulchan Aruch. Do not let the sun set without his having. Similarly, it is a mitzvah to pay for the hire of an animal or a utensil on time, and if one delays payment, one violates one of the Torah's prohibitions. So you would think maybe it's a little different. You know, you hire somebody for their own work is one thing, but if I rent out your space, maybe that's different. Or if I rent a car from you, right? Me and Annie make some sort of, she's leaving out of town. I say, hey, can I rent your car while you're gone? 2 weeks, I'm going to rent your car, and I'm going to pay you X amount of money. Maybe that's different. No. Turns out that it works exactly the same way. There's another verse that says, do not withhold the wages of the poor and the destitute. Pay him his wages on the day they are due. When are a worker's wages due? Right? So if he completes his work during the day, he may be paid throughout the entire day. If the day passes, here's the answer to your question, without the employer's paying him, the employer transgresses the prohibition, pay him his wages on the day they are due. Do not let the sun set without him having been paid. If he completes his work after nightfall, he may be paid throughout the entire night. If the night passes without the employer's paying him, the employer transgresses the prohibition in the verse of Vayikra, do not hold the wages of a worker with you until the morning. So in other words, there's two different verses that talk about whether he was working by day or whether he was working by night. If he was working by day, if he completed his work by day, then you have to pay him before sunset, like we were talking about, or before dark. And if he completes his work during the nighttime, then you have to pay him before the sunrise or whatever, right? Until the day is done. Similar principles apply regarding a worker paid by the week, paid by the month, or paid by the year. If he completes his work during the day, he should be paid before the conclusion of that day. If he completes his work at night, he should be paid that night. No further delay is allowed. So let's translate this into the U.S. workforce. So let's say a person is on salary, and the way that company works is that you get paid every 2 weeks, right? I think that's probably most common, right? On Friday. So from a Torah perspective, he's essentially working for you in 2-week installments. So he has 2 weeks worth of work that he completes, and then he gets his salary. Does that make sense? And then that salary is due. So let's say the end of that workday is on Friday, and right, so he has to get paid that Friday. From a Torah perspective, he would have to get paid before sunset or before dark on that day. Or if it's a nighttime gig, then he would have to get paid before sunrise on that day. Does that make sense? And the same thing as if he gets paid an annual salary. If somebody gets paid on a yearly basis for some reason, whatever the thing is, right? Imagine there's some sort of independent contractor that does work for you all year, and it's not too much, a couple $1,000 for the whole year, a gardener or something, and you're supposed to pay them once a year. Gardeners usually pay once a month, but whatever, right? But whatever, we're going here with hypotheticals. So then, essentially, it's as if that's the work that they're doing for you, and then that's when you need to pay it. And delaying it past that is considered this prohibition of delay. So far, this has been the classic employer that we've spoken about, like that most of us are familiar with, right? But let's get to the second version that I spoke about, which is more like an independent contractor. So the Shulchan Aruch continues. Similarly, when a person contracts a craftsman to fix a garment, and the craftsman brings him the garment during the day, he must pay him on that day. If he brings him at night, he must pay him that night. As long as the garment is in the craftsman's hands, even if he has completed his work, the person who contracted him is not considered to have violated the above prohibition. So let's say I bring my shoes into a shoemaker, and the shoes are completed 2 days later, or cleaners, right? Completed 2 days later, but I don't come to pick them up for a week. Right? So I do not have to pay so long as he still has my object. It's picking it up that ends the work, so to speak. I don't know if this is the reason, but I would imagine that part of what plays a role here is there's always there's a two-way street anytime you give something to an independent contractor to do something for you. So let's say a cleaners, for example. You give it always cracks me up that like we're the ones who pay the cleaners. I mean that we pay the cleaners. In theory, the cleaners has much more money on us than we have on them. Does anybody ever realize that? Like you give them a beautiful gown, you tell them, here, I need this dry cleaned. You give them a $300 piece, and you're paying them $15.99 to clean it. Or whatever, I don't know, whatever the going rate is for a gown. Probably more than $15.99, right? Whatever it is, right? Well, probably more, right? Over 20 probably, yeah. Yeah, together with everything else, cleaners have really gone up, huh? Now what's my point? My point is, so yes, it's true that as soon as they complete it, in theory, you owe them the money because they did the job for you. But they also have your $300 piece. So the transaction is not complete. They still have an obligation to you where they're now guarding. If the cleaner says, I finished, usually they have a policy, 30 days, and then they donate it or whatever it is, right? But let's say it's still within their policy. So you're 5 days late to pick up your cleaners. Late, whatever. You're allowed to pick it up whenever you want. In theory, I don't think they have it, right? Unless it's a policy of 30 days or something. So now you come 5 days late. Actually, what happened is, like in theory, the cleaners could say you owe us now more money. Why? Because they're now holding on to it for longer for you. So now they've taken on a separate obligation. If the day after they finish their work, let's say it was mending it or cleaning it or whatever it is, right? If the day after they finish their work, they have a robbery in their store, and it gets stolen. I don't know what they're going to do about it. That's a whole different question, whether they have insurance and they're going to get it covered, etc. But they have an obligation to you now to pay you back for your garment. So it turns out they didn't just, the contract between you and them is not just to clean my garment, it's also to watch my garment for the period that you have it. And that extends beyond the repair that they do for the garment. Does that make sense? It can extend for a week or two until you pick it up. So then how can you pay them? How can you be obligated to pay them before that? So really the transaction doesn't end when they complete the work, the transaction ends when they give you back the item that they are working on. Does that make sense in everybody's mind? So that's where we are here. Okay. This applies even when the completed garment remains in the craftsman's hands for several days, and even when the craftsman informed the owner of the garment to come pay for his work and collect his property. So even if you get an email from the cleaners that says your thing is ready for pickup, and you come only 3 days later because you're out of town and you figure whatever, yeah, it's fine, it's ready for pickup. I'm glad that they did it on time. Sometimes we need them to do it that day, right? Like, oh, it's a wedding and I need it. So then it's a whole different story. But sometimes you're okay picking it up later. You're like, they tell you, oh, it'll be ready Wednesday by 5 o'clock, and you're like, it could be next Wednesday 5 o'clock for all I care because I'm going out of town for 2 weeks and I'll pick it up when I get back. So then all of these laws apply. Number 4, an employer does not violate either of the prohibitions mentioned in Law 2 unless the employee asks for payment and the employer has the money to pay him. So this is a very interesting nuance that we got now. You can have an agreement, right? That you have to be paid by the end of the month. And Friday comes, and remember, by the end of 2 weeks. And Friday comes, and you're supposed to be paid, and you don't get paid. If you don't ask for if the employee does not ask for their wages, then the employer does not technically violate the prohibition. They're supposed to pay them before sunset, but they don't technically violate the prohibition unless he asks for it and they withhold it. If, however, the employee does not demand his wages or the employer does not have the funds to pay him, he does not violate these prohibitions. It is, however, considered pious conduct to borrow money to pay a worker on time since he is poor and his life depends on it. So, if you don't have the funds to pay, right? So let's say As we discussed, the employer is not always the bad guy. Sometimes the employer cannot pay because he simply does not have the funds. If he didn't pay because he just doesn't, he's not sensitive enough to value the fact that his employee might need the wages to live for the next week, that's obviously where this biblical prohibition comes in. If he doesn't have the money, here's where we get into this window. He's not biblically violating the prohibition. He doesn't have the money. He's at a loss just like the other guy's at a loss. He didn't, whatever, something happened and he lost a lot of money this month, and therefore he cannot pay his the wages of the employee on time. He simply doesn't have the money. So this is where we get into this window where technically, biblically, he's not violating prohibition, but there's a verse that, based on the verse in Deuteronomy, he is poor and his life depends on it. The employer should, this is pious conduct, this is not required by law, but this is what a pious person should do. This is what the Torah is advising us to do. He should borrow money in order to pay his employees. So that's this little window here, okay. Similarly, when an employer customarily does not pay his workers until he makes a total account of his affairs, he is not considered to have violated the above prohibitions, even when the workers ask for payment of a sum that is surely due to them. So obviously we're playing with a scenario here. This is not a regular company, this is not regular salary. This is, I don't know, let's say a farmer's market every week. Right? And maybe there's a commission based. Or maybe there's whatever, for whatever reason, or even if it's a salary, but the person who has the they total up how much they made, and then but this week has been a busy week. And now they're going out of town for 3 days. So the reason that they're not paying them is because there's a system how this works. I total up everything I made, and then I take from that money and I pay you. And even if it's a set salary, it doesn't make a difference. Even if it's not if it's commission based, then he's like, I can't even give it to you because I don't know how much commission there is. And we need to total up the amounts. And yes, I usually do it in time, but this week I couldn't because I'm out of town or I was busy or whatever it was. So it turns out in this case, the employer also has rights. Like he has a right to be able to be busy. He has a right to be able to delay it a few days if there's a reasonable reason for why he's doing it. Like in this case, because he's making the cheshbonot, he's making the calculations to figure out how much he made and then pay them. So even if they're asking, and they're asking for the amount that they're supposed to be paid, the amount that's due to them, still he has a right to delay it because he's still making the calculations. And this is where, obviously, we're not getting into like all the meta laws, like what's if he's just using that as an excuse, but really he has other reasons and he's kicking the can down the road, but really he could pay them, but he's saying, I haven't made my calculations yet, right? Obviously that's where the Beit Din would have to get involved, and that's a dispute. It's a case of dispute. But what is the basis here that the employer is relying on? And I guess this is where it would help for some of the ambiguity where he can't just use it as an excuse. Since this is his established practice, we assume that they agreed to work for him according to these conditions. So this is a very important point. This and in practice, this gets applied to many other cases, which is as follows. If there is an established practice, so in this case, the established practice is that it takes me between a day and 3 days to calculate my earnings and then I pay you. Or I first pay. Let's play with this scenario a little bit, right? First, I pay all of my before I pay employees. I first pay the farmers market their dues, or I first pay my suppliers, or whatever it is. Right? There's like a hierarchy maybe of as to how he pays and how that works. Now, the employee can jump up and down until he's blue in the face and say that's not fair. I want to be higher up on the hierarchy. But that's not what we're basing it on. We're not saying that he's just getting messed over just because he happens to be this guy or that guy or whatever it is. What we're saying is that because there is an established practice, whatever that established practice is, obviously not an abusive practice, but a normal, regular established practice. So, for example, it could be that he doesn't, at the end of a 2-week period, he doesn't get paid immediately. He gets paid 1 week later for the last 2-week period. If that is the established practice, then we assume that when they signed the contract to begin with, even if it wasn't clear in the contract, Judaism doesn't always, it's not always about what it says in the contract. I think even U.S. laws like this. Sometimes there's implied understandings. Not every single thing has to be written down. Especially if there's an implied understanding and you've been following that for a year or two, and then all of a sudden this week you have an issue with it, right? So what we're saying is that because it was assumed to be, because that's the established practice. This is the way he does things usually. So therefore, if the person went into employment with them, we assume that was part of the agreement and the understanding when they went into it. That yes, it's going to be between 1 and 3 days after the farmer's market stand closes till I finish my earnings and then I do it. Right? So this is where when things get ambiguous and we're worried, let's say the employer is abusing this, right? Let's say it's 2 weeks later. And the employer comes and says, well, I have this to rely on. I'm still calculating how much I made that week and I still haven't calculated it. That's why I haven't paid him. Let's say they're in Beit Din. Let's assume they're in front of us and we're the Beit Din. We're the court of law that has to tell them what's the right thing to do according to Torah law. So we can say, hold on a second. Let's just go based on precedent. Let's see what's going on. What is the established practice? Okay, you always make a calculation before you pay him? Okay, great. So you don't need to pay him as soon as the farmer's market is done. Right? everybody's with me in my example here, right? There's an employee, let's say, behind the table that usually runs the farmer's market for you, and you have to pay them, right? So we say, okay, that's fine. He has that on his side, but let's use 1 year or 1 month or 2-3 months or since you started working for him as our established practice. What was the average? Right? Let's say sometimes it's 1 day, sometimes it's 2 days. Sometimes he's busy or sometimes he's less busy. Sometimes there's vacation right afterwards and he can't do it. Okay, but let's establish an average. It's always between 1 and 3 days. It's always within 1 week. Okay, so now he's coming and he's saying it's 3 weeks. That's considered late. Does that make sense? Because there's an established practice for how he believes it's supposed to be done. Meaning, not believes, for the assumption that he's under for when he's going to get paid. Okay? I actually have a personal example that I can use for this. I have a housekeeper at home, right? And she comes, however many days a week, whatever the exact, how many hours a week it is, right? Gitty and I always like that they come more often, especially with little kids at home. We like that they come more often, less time. Because we're like, you come, you do whatever you do, and then, but come more often because there's constant stuff to do. Anyways, so then, now, in theory, we would like to pay them every single Friday. We'd like to pay her every single Friday. And Gitty and I have discussed this, and we try as often as we can. As you can imagine, the past few Fridays has been difficult. Shabbos comes in at like 4 something, get to the bank, get cash, get paid. It doesn't always happen, right? But I think that if you were to ask my housekeeper, and I never have asked her, but if you were to ask her and say, okay, between when and when does the rabbi pay you? I don't think she would say they pay me every single Friday. I think she would say they try to pay me every Friday, but always by Monday, which is the next time she comes, I get paid. Okay, so then that becomes the established norm, and that becomes the official agreement that they went into when. We never made up officially when we pay her, right? And obviously, there's also other times. There's times when we leave out of town and then we pay her on a Wednesday or whatever it is before we do, right? But I think everybody understands what I'm saying here, right? So in other words, once there's an established custom, that becomes the established custom. So for me to pay her after 2 weeks of work would be totally out of the norm, and that would be considered halanas schar for me. That would be considered delaying payment, unless I have a reason for it. I don't have money to pay her this week, and I can't make it to the bank, or I'm going out of town, and I tell her, hey, this week it's in the X, Y, and Z, and therefore I'm going to delay it by this amount, right? And that's where things start to get to. If she needs it, she can demand it of me, and then if I have them, if I don't have the money, I can say whatever. But the pious thing would be to borrow it, etc. Right? Everybody with me here so far? Okay. Let's do some questions. Vicky.
This became very interesting, like during COVID, where the banks were closed and you couldn't easily get to a bank. You may not have had an ATM card. Some of the older people don't do that. Also during the fires, where things were closed for extended periods of time, or the government shutdown, and the suppliers weren't getting paid. So how do they pay their employees because they're not getting their money? And it would have been interesting to see how a Bet Din would have handled these. It
would have been based on these laws.
Yeah.
It would have been based on these laws, but probably would have been allowance. I mean, you see that the laws are allowing for out of the norm situations, yeah. By the way, that ended up applying to lots of things. That ended up applying, for example, to tuition. I remember the school that Menachem was in, which was a preschool in Burbank. It was before Gitti opened up the Gan. Gitti opened up the Gan right after COVID. No, even later. I think maybe 2022, whatever it was. Well, I guess COVID is still not over, right? It never had, it doesn't have an end date. I'm saying after COVID. I don't know when that is. Anyways, and I remember the school treated us very, very respectfully, which I heard a lot of other schools did not. I heard that there were people this was a private school. I heard there were lots of private schools that said, you have to continue paying tuition. We have to continue paying our teachers. We can't, just because they cannot come in and teach, they're willing to come in and teach, and they would like to come in and teach, just because they have to be paid, and we're going to continue to pay them, and you have to continue to pay tuition, even though you're getting only an hour on Zoom. For example, this was a preschool. There was no 8 hours of Zoom school, you know what I mean? Like there was an hour of Zoom singing on the thing, and that's it. And then the rest of the day we had Menachem at home with us. We had only Menachem. Or Bina was born in 2020, so. But I remember they sent out an email, which was very, very, so it's very similar to what you're saying. They sent out an email, and they said actually that they're not going to be charging tuition. But they said, we want to be very transparent with everyone, and then we'd like to ask for your donations. So what they said was, here is our budget. It was a preschool under Chabad. So they made it very clear, what responsibilities they have for the preschool and what's for Chabad and how the budgets are separated, exact amounts, and how, and I think the director was not taking a salary, meaning because she got paid by Chabad, but, right? That's what, and anyways, or maybe she was taking a salary very minimal, whatever it was. And they said, and this is, they didn't disclose everyone's salaries, right? But they kind of gave you an idea of what's going on. This is the total number that we usually need. these are the expenses that we're not going to need to pay during COVID, during this period, which is XYZ. And we're going to provide an hour every day that you can come in and the kids can interact over Zoom, etc. And now you can make your decision. We ask that you donate, and Kitty and I, of course, made a donation. It wasn't a question. Like, you can't just leave them high and dry like that. But yeah, that's where all these in Hebrew they're called yotzei min haklal, like the exceptions to the rule. Okay, I want to try to finish this topic. So let's go back inside. Let's talk about, so last week we spoke about the employee's obligations to the employer. This week we started off talking about the employer's obligations to the employee. Let's talk about where the two are they're both not doing what they're supposed to, right? Okay, let's dive into it. Halacha, hey. When an employer hired to work for an employee, when an employee hired to work for an employer destroys the material with which he was given to work, the employer should go beyond the measure of the law and forego the claim, despite the fact that the employee would be held liable because the loss was caused by his negligence, as it says in Mishlei, which is Proverbs, as the pasuk exhorts us, so that you will walk in good paths. Okay, this is a pasuk in Mishlei, the Mantelech B'derech Tovim, which encourages us to go beyond the letter of the law. Now, obviously, this is where everybody starts to get very nervous. They're like, hold on a second. So let's say I'm an antique dealer. You'll soon see why I'm using this example. I wonder if any of you remember. But let's say you're an antique dealer, and you have a couple of schleppers, guys that just haul the antiques back and forth, and you go and you meet with people, right? And you negotiate a deal over their gorgeous table with a marble top or whatever it is, right? And then once you negotiate how much you're going to buy it from them for, these schleppers take it, they pick it up, they haul it into the U-Haul truck. They're supposed to do it very carefully with blankets and everything, etc. And then they bring it to your antique shop, and then you sell it to other people, and then they help it pull it back and forth. And one time he takes it and he drops it, and the marble slab shatters into 1,000,000 pieces. In theory, the employer can obligate the employee for ruining his property. Why? Because yes, when you go into employment with someone, you have an obligation to also make sure that you're not going to ruin the stuff that you're being given by him to work. Right? Whether that's your computer at your desk or a fancy marble top table. However, this is one of those spaces because he was working for you, especially if it wasn't intentional and he was doing everything he was supposed to, etc. This is one of those instances in which the Torah would encourage us to be pious and encourage us to go beyond the letter of the law and to pay them. Does anybody know why I used an antique dealer and a table with a marble countertop? Does anybody know why I used that in that case? Anybody remember?
I can guess.
What?
That's what I can guess.
Okay,
That's
guess.
what it is.
Go ahead.
Well, you have a working person who doesn't get paid that much to do a schlepper.
Okay.
And, they need to drop the table. And, it's hundreds of dollars to replace a marble slab, easy. And, they don't have
Right.
the money. I mean, they're taking out of their wages for, weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks.
But I want to remind you, there's a person on the other side, right? We always assume the employer is the bad guy, right? What's if the employer is like, his margins were so thin to begin with, and now he ruined this, and now he has to pay the guy $thousands of dollars.
Yeah, I know.
So that's why I think the Torah doesn't obligate him to pay it. But we are encouraged to go beyond the letter of the law. The reason I use this particular example is because in 2018, we hosted a speaker here, whose name was Frank Mink. And he was a former white, you were there? No. And he was a former white supremacist. He was a former white supremacist and a neo-Nazi. And there was a period when he had a swastika tattooed on his neck. Eventually he got it removed. And this is years ago. And for 20, 30 years already, he's been out of those gangs and out of that life. And I mean, he's still not, he's still a rough and tumble kind of guy. But he's still got plenty of tattoos. He still talks like you would expect somebody like that to talk, but the hatred has gone from his heart. And there's a story how that happened. And today, of course, what he does actually with his life, a lot of what he does is he works with troubled teens and gang members, etc., to talk to them about getting out of it. His name was Frank Mink. You can look it up actually. You can Google Frank Mink, Zoshi Rifkin op-ed if you'd like, and you can see the article that I posted then in the Pasadena Now and the Pasadena Star News, etc. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. We had a nice big crowd here, etc. And his story was basically this. If you'd like to watch it, not to talk from here, we didn't record that, but if you'd like to watch his story, there's a 4-part series by Steven Spielberg. You can get it on whatever, on Netflix, or I don't know if Netflix, but definitely on any of the rentals. It's called Why We Hate. And one of them is his story. One of the episodes is his story. Anyways, and the main story that he says turned him around is he was working in Philly, in South Philly, and it's an amazing story. He had a Jewish employer, not religious. How he ended up working as a complete anti-Semite neo-Nazi for a Jewish employer is a crazy story, because he was desperate for the work, and they both, the person who made the match between the two of them told him, he's Jewish and he hates your guy, he's an anti-Semite, etc. And he ended up working for him, and he was an antique dealer, and he was hired as a schlepper, and he would carry the things, etc. And one time there was a table with a marble slab on top, and he dropped it, and he says it was his fault because he knew this wasn't his first day on the job, and he knew he was supposed to transport them one at a time. You take the marble slab first, you wrap it in blankets, and you put it in the thing, and then you take the base, etc. You're supposed to, and he was lazy, and he wanted to get the job done quicker, so he tried to take both at the same time, and the marble slab slipped out and fell on the floor in front of the seller who had just gotten his money, and the buyer who was his boss, right? And it was very quiet and whatever, and he wrapped it all up, and he says he remembers the drive home. They were driving the truck back home, and he remembers thinking, that's it, that's the end of it. I'm going to lose my job. There's no way this guy's going to stand for this, etc. He just lost God knows how much money off of me, etc. And at the end of the job, he handed the envelope. And he said to him, I'll see you tomorrow. I think he even drove him home to a bad neighborhood of town, handed him his envelope with his wages, and he said, I'll see you tomorrow, 9 o'clock. And he said, what do we see you tomorrow? He said, you're not firing me? He said, I'll fire you. Of course, you made a mistake, but it's how it works. It happens in this line of business. But of course you're still my employee. I said, and he says that was the beginning of the end. He said it was a few days later that he went home and he symbolically, I think, burnt his boots or something like that. His boots were a big part of the statement of the being part of that gang. It was a particular type of boots or whatever. And he turned his life around, and today he's an amazing individual, Frank Mink. He's done amazing things. And all of this was because of somebody who kept this law about that, even though technically he was in the right, and any employer has the right to tell their employee, you ruined the things that you weren't just using it, you ruined it. You destroyed the computer. You on your way, what's like the classic movie scene. As they fire them, they slap whatever before they quit, they take the computer and throw it out the window, whatever. Right? You ruined my property. You have an obligation to pay me my property. But the Torah encourages us to go beyond the letter of the law and to be kind to our employees and to pay and to not obligate them to pay for that. Obviously, like I was countering to Joe, if you're in a situation where you're going to lose money, etc., whatever, everybody has to take their situation at hand and to figure it out. But I just want to share that story because I thought it's a very relevant part of the story. Let's finish this off. If the employee is poor and relies on his work to purchase his necessities, the employer should also pay him his wages, as the verse continues, and you shall keep to the ways of the righteous. This is the way of the righteous, to adhere by the way of God, to perform charity and justice beyond the measure of the law. Okay? And then the rest we already learned about the employees, the obligations of an employee to the employer. Thank you all for joining us today for Mentsch at Work. I look forward to seeing you all next week at 9:30, either here in person or on Facebook. And have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.